Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Nina Fondeller-Walden, the Managing Director of Chai Mitzvah, the Resource Center for Jewish Engagement. Chai Mitzvah, the sponsor of Scholar Circle, is a Jewish engagement program that partners with over 700 organizations and has worked with over 9,000 individuals in small group learning, social action, and spiritual and ritual development. We have over 20 curricula tailored for small group conversation, for teens and adults, lay or professionally led. To learn more, visit our website, chaimitzvah.org. The Scholar Circle hosts lectures by prominent scholars every 2 weeks on topics relating to Israel and the Jewish community, geared towards rabbis, educators, and lay leaders who are charged with explaining the complex issues which the Jewish community is facing. To that end, each lecture will have a resource sheet that will be sent to you after the lecture. A recording of each lecture will be accessible on our website and shared with you through email. Our featured scholar is Dr. Olga Kirschbaum-Sharansky, who is an historian, editor, and co-founder of Tel Aviv Review of Books and visiting fellow at the Tel Aviv Institute. She received her PhD in modern European history from New York University, focusing on intergroup and interfaith relations, as well as nationalism, colonialism, and international politics in the modern period. Before I welcome our scholar, a couple of housekeeping items. To submit questions, please use the Q&A button on your screen. Q&A will be held at about 40 minutes into the lecture, but you can submit questions anytime throughout. The lecture recording will be sent to your email in a few days and will also be available on our website at chaimitzvah.org. Now to Dr. Olga Kirschbaum-Sharansky.
Thank you very much for Chai Mitzvah for having me for this talk. And I'm really pleased to talk about this issue of the history of the region of the Middle East from World War I till today, because it's very important in the context of today's conflict. A lot of the conflict revolves around historical arguments. So the people who are against the existence of the state of Israel will make historical arguments like Israel is an illegitimate settler colonial state, or it's a European state, or will say things like it's an apartheid state. So these are arguments that have to do with history and with the history of the modern Zionist movement. And I think that the Jewish community and Jewish educators and rabbis and people have been doing, I think, a solid job in explaining that the Zionist movement, it's hard to call it a settler colonial movement. There are things that are very different between the Zionist movement and settler colonial movements from Europe to the Americas or elsewhere because of the historical presence of the Jewish people in the Middle East and North Africa. And while that is a message that I think is being communicated and getting through, there is at the same time, I think, within the Jewish community and also in the broader American context, less understanding about how Zionism fits in the broader Middle Eastern conflict or context, rather. Meaning, is the Zionist movement a unicorn, in this region, or are there similarities with other national movements in the region and with other developments in the region? And how does the region compare to Europe? And what is that this is what I want to address today, because I think that looking at the history of the Middle East in World War I, since World War I, and understanding the Zionist movement, and also, by the way, the Palestinian nationalist movement within that context, will give people who would like to see not only the continued existence of the State of Israel, but a prosperous Middle Eastern region where people of different nationalities and religions respect each other, that will give them a better understanding of this picture. So I'd like to start by this talk. So how the talk is going to be divided is I'm going to give a little bit of a sort of a more basic background on who are the peoples and religions of the Middle East. And then I'm going to go into sort of major political developments that happened before World War I. And then afterwards, sort of what happens around World War I and afterwards, and why, in fact, World War I, that we're still living in the shadow of World War I, and that many of the political developments that have happened and the conflicts that exist in the entire Middle East are resulting from decisions that were made during or in the aftermath of World War I. So to start with the talk, just if you could, Simon, if you could bring up map 1. So map one is an important map because if you, for most of the period of the Middle East, now this is a map from the Middle Ages, but there have been many historic peoples in the Middle East, and some of you, if you read the Hebrew Bible, you've heard of some of these peoples. Of course, they're the Hebrews, but they're the Assyrians. There are the Babylonians. There are the Ammonites, the Edomites, or all kinds of different historical peoples. But there are also already in the biblical, in the ancient times, and then afterwards in post-biblical, there's all these empires that cross the Middle East, right? You can almost make a joke that every Jewish holiday is a different empire, right? Hanukkah is the Greeks, the Purim is the Persians. So this particular map is of the Arab Empire, the Arab Caliphates, and it's after after the early period in the 7th and 8th century. This one, and you see that the Caliphates they're large. It's a very large empire, and this empire is important because of that. The presence of Arabs, who are a people who are indigenous to the Arabian Peninsula, is something that spreads across the Middle East and North Africa with these caliphates. And if you could move to map 2, it's important for us. This is a map. If you can see, it's the outline of Africa and the Middle East. You can see clearly Saudi Arabia and the Arabian Peninsula. So this is a colored map of the Arab League, which is a league that still exists today. And it's colored, the lightest colored ones are the member states that were founding states in 1945. And then subsequent, the darker you go, in the 50s and 60s and in 70s that these states joined. Now, if you go back to map 1, you can see that there's a fair crossover between the Arab League states and this caliphate, and it's because different empires in the world have a different impact, right? Like we in the United States, people, or in Canada where I grew up, people are living the impact of the British Empire's colonization of the Americas and the arrival of colonists in this area. And so the Middle East and North Africa, so the Roman Empire and the subsequent Byzantine Empire had the strong impact of Christianizing a number of peoples in the region. That's why we have local Christian churches. We have the Egyptian Coptic Church, or we have the Armenian Christian Church, or the Ethiopian Christian Church, the Georgian Christian churches, these national churches in the region, the Syrian churches, and the Muslim Empire had the impact of spreading the Arabic language and spreading Islam in much of the region, and also spreading people of Arab ancestry. And so this is why we come to this expression of the Arab world. And that's why a lot of people think that the Middle East and North Africa are the Arab world, right? Because these regions definitely are impacted by the Arab empires, the Arab caliphates, and they have a lasting impact until this day. Now, if we go to map 4, before I stop for a second, before we go to map 4, I just want to say something. Even though this region is called the Arab world, and this is what I'm going to get into in my talk a little bit, many of the peoples who predate the Arab conquests, right, including the Jewish people, but not limited to the Jewish people, other peoples that we know from antiquity, like the Assyrians, right, or like the Armenians. These are peoples who are documented in late antiquity, some of them even in the late Iron Age. They continue to exist. They don't disappear, meaning they're not fully Arabized. They're not fully Islamified. So we have a situation whereby empires have a large impact on the world, and they impact by maybe changing religions or languages of areas, but they don't at the same time succeed in fully homogenizing the populations where they are. Even in the Americas, where both disease and military campaigns devastated Native American populations, there still are Native American populations across the Americas. From north to south, so empires don't always win out in completely changing the region. Now, if you could move to map 4, the last empire. I alluded to the different empires that we know from Jewish history, and which of course conquered many of the neighboring areas. So we talked about the Persian, the Greek, the Roman, the Arab caliphates, and then the Ottoman Empire is important because it's the empire that brings us to World War I, which is the topic of our talk. And the Ottoman Empire has it also, like the Arab Caliphate, has some impact on the regions that it rules. Most notably, a lot of Turkish settlers move into southern Europe, the Balkans, which the Ottoman Empire conquers. There are less Turkish-speaking people that move into the area of the Middle East, or what's the Levant today, Syria, Iraq, although there are some, but less in number than in southern Europe. And so the Ottoman Empire doesn't have the same impact in terms of making Turkish the language of the region. Arabic, in that respect, the caliphates have a stronger long-term impact with the influence of Arabic and Arabic speakers in the region and Islamification. The Ottoman Empire does Islamify some peoples in southern Europe, but many peoples are already Muslim, and it doesn't succeed that much in making Middle Eastern Christians Muslim. But it's the last empire of the region. Now, if we could move to map 5, the Ottoman Empire, and this brings us, there's another Muslim empire that's of great importance in the modern period, and that is also around, including up until World War I, and that's the Iranian, or the Safavid Empire. And if you can see here in this map, you see that the Iranians and the Ottomans actually were in conflict with one another, and the Iranians had managed to conquer lots of areas of the Middle East and up into the Caucasus, what are today Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. And so this brings us, this is important too, because the Persians are Shia Muslims, and the caliphates, most of them are ruled by Sunni Muslims. I mean, that's a sort of story in itself, but as we get to the modern period, the main center of Shia Islam is in Iran. And so since Iran is controlling parts of these areas, this has also a lasting impact. Some of it predates the Safavid Empire, but some of it gets expanded during the Safavid period, of Shia Muslims in areas like Iraq and Syria, and even the Gulf, Persian Gulf region. So if we could move to map number 6, this is going to bring us into the part of the talk about the major political developments before World War I. So, books and libraries have been written on this topic. And at the same time, I think that we can sort of take a bird's eye view, and we can talk in a very deep way about some major important political developments that give us a framework for then understanding and deepening, if you want to, after this talk or whatever, some of the things that are happening. But in Europe, as there are also important empires continentally that are ruling over multiple populations. So again, what we've understood with the Middle East is that the empires of the Middle East never succeeded in fully homogenizing all of these smaller peoples. And some of these smaller peoples that continue to exist in the region. So I gave some examples. I talked about the Assyrians. I talked about the Jews. I talked about the Armenians. We could add the Kurds. Those are peoples who never ruled an empire in the region, but were not fully assimilated by the empires that ruled the region. Similarly, in Europe, we have smaller peoples, particularly Slavic peoples in Central Europe, Baltic peoples in northeastern Europe and Balkan Slavs in southeastern Europe that are not fully assimilated by these different empires. The Ottoman Empire does not assimilate them to Islam or to the Turkish language. The Austro-Hungarian Empire does not succeed, even though the Hungarians by the 19th century have a policy of forced, they call it majorization, forcing people to speak Hungarian. They don't succeed in that program of making everyone into Hungarian. You have even places like the United Kingdom, the Kingdom of France, and the Kingdom of Spain, which seem like kingdoms and not empires. They're actually multinational states under the dominance of one group, and we know this with Wales and Ireland and Scotland and Welsh and these other peoples who are within, in case of the United Kingdom, and in case of Spain and France, there's something similar. So empires are very important in this period, and this gets us to the major developments of the 19th century. The 19th century is, in a way, a century of contradictions, because it's kind of the height of imperial expansion and competition between major imperial powers, both the big Muslim imperial powers, the Persian and the Ottoman, and the European imperial powers, the British and the French in particular. Spain is already an empire on the wane. It's dying, or it's losing territory. On the one hand, so we have empires in full swing, and the Russian Empire, and they're in competition with each other for tradeways, for resources, for power, and at the same time, you have the development of national liberation movements, meaning these smaller peoples who never lost some form of identity are consolidating in political movements. Often they're consolidating cultural movements, things like standardizing their language or developing their literature or their culture in various ways, and seeking to have independence from various empires. And one of the first places that we see this are in the wars of independence against the Ottoman Empire in the early 19th century, the Greek War of Independence, and the Serbian War of Independence. And then, we have, if any of you have done European history, you have the Spring of Nations in 1848. Before that, you have the Poles trying to regain some form of Polish state, which they had lost. They had been divided up by two of the major continental empires. So those are two major political directions: the imperial direction and the national direction that are coexisting. In the Americas, there's something somewhere, a kind of hybrid that's happening, which is that leaders who had been from the imperial powers or imperial diaspora, so sort of British Europeans or Spanish Europeans, sometimes married or with native people, sometimes not, are seeking to break off from the empire, but they usually maintain the empire strategy vis-a-vis native populations, or in the case of other places, enslaved Africans. So that's a bit of a different story, and we won't get into it, although I'll mention it when we get to World War I. So if we could have the map of the world, map 7. So this is a map in the mid 19th century. And so we see the height of the empires. The Russian Empire has been slowly but surely over the past couple of centuries conquering Siberia. You have the British, the French, you have the Ottoman, you have the Persian, you have empires in China. So empires really having a heyday in the 19th century, but you have these national movements as well. One of the most important things, though, in this imperial competition is the so-called Great Game, which is the Ottoman Empire is losing its technological and its military advantage vis-a-vis the European empires. And the Europeans are hoping to cash in on this and to be able to sort of get their piece of the pie, so to speak, of the Ottoman Empire. And the national groups within it, I spoke about Greek and Serbian independence. They are also trying to fight against seeing the weakness of the Ottoman Empire and fighting for their independence. And where these two matters meet, which is of great importance for the Middle East, is that the Western European states often seek to have some kind of alliance with national groups or try to support national groups within the Ottoman Empire, particularly Christian ones, but not only. By the end of by the time we get to World War I, as a means of weakening. So they have their own interests; they want to weaken the Ottoman Empire, but these national groups also see an opportunity in leveraging an alliance with other empires in order to achieve their national ends. So this is sort of what's leading up. There are two other very important political developments that have lasting impact in the Middle East, other than imperialism and nationalism, and that's the issue of religion and I'm going to call political economy, which is that in the Middle East, like in Europe, the issue of modernity and Western culture and religion and science, these are all it's impacting these areas also, and so the different political movements that arise in this period, national movements, imperial movements, they're also sometimes divided by how they approach religion, whether they're more secular, they're more traditionalist, more conservative, also how they understand the economy, if they're and there is an impact in the Middle East of socialist ideas across the region, and so these two factors are very important also, and an additional way that they're important is that the Muslim empires are asking the question, why Islam, or why they lost their power? Because if we go back to map 1, the Muslim empires have a memory of themselves of being very powerful and very large. You can see that the Umayyad Caliphate is very extensive, much more extensive geographically than any empire in Europe, and very powerful. And so the Ottoman Empire and the Persian Empire, by the end of this period, and all the Muslims living within them, whether they're, not every single one, but significant numbers of Muslims, that's what I mean by that, are asking, why is it that the European powers got so much more powerful militarily and monetarily and culturally? And so there's a whole dealing with the West in Islamic thinking, and this leads to different religious and political movements within the region that continue to impact us today. Now, I'm not really going to go through World War I per se, because the battles of World War I are not that relevant for this particular talk. What's relevant is that by the end of the war, the Ottoman Empire has lost very badly, as have the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Russians. The Russian Revolution occurs, and so they extract themselves from the conflict and a series of treaties succeed, and the British and the French and the Italians, to a lesser degree, have a tremendous room to maneuver in terms of the world that they want to create, and the Americans also, who come into the war later, and because of the loss that the Ottomans have and the Austro-Hungarians have, and so they can really change the map of the region, and they do that in a series of treaties. Actually 16 treaties after World War I, 7 that are really important. If you could bring up document 1, Treaties of World War I, just gives a brief list of these treaties, and you can see that there we go, just very good. So you can see that this is a long process. We're used to thinking about Versailles, but there's actually multiple treaties, and it takes a period of several years to deal with the entire region and to settle borders for the region and what to do with the various populations. So going back to what I said before about the 19th century and the Western powers had relationships with all of these national and religious groups in the Ottoman Empire. And so over the course of the war, and particularly for this first treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, these national minorities in the Middle East were already, their leadership was coming up with sort of hopeful, or what their expectations were, and in some cases what they thought the British or the French had promised them that they would get following the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in the area. So if you could go to map 8. So one of the peoples that I talked about are the Kurds. Map 8. So the Kurds they're the largest stateless people in the world. So they don't have their own state, and they're divided between Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Turkey. But the Kurds wanted their own state after World War I, and this is in one of the variations, it's in the provisions of the Treaty of Sèvres, which is in 1920, of what that Kurdish state might look like. Now, this Kurdish state didn't come into being. Another, if you could take map 9, another group who had worked together with the British against the Ottomans and who had also been given various promises by the British were the Assyrians. So the Assyrians are an old people. They're, we know them from the Bible. They're Semitic people who were then Christianized. And this is the state that they hoped that they would get, and the independence that they hoped they would get after. And they had suffered, while it's known, many people know about the Armenian genocide. The Assyrians were also targeted by the Ottoman authorities and then later the Turks with genocidal actions, and so they really badly wanted a state. If we could look at a map 10. If you see, so on your left, you see their mandate for Syria and Lebanon in 1922. So this gives you a sense also of the different ethnic groups. You have the Druze. What's in green, Greater Lebanon, is it to a large degree Maronite Christian, not only, but with some, and then the Alawites. The Alawites today are known because of the Assad family. Are Alawites. They had a strong presence in the Syrian military, even though they're actually a small kind of semi-Muslim subsect. They come out of Islam, but Muslims don't recognize them as fully Muslim. So this gives you a sense of these different groups in the region that had hoped, so that if we go back, we understand that Iraq not only has some Shia Muslims and some Sunni Muslims, but it has different national groups in it, Kurds, Assyrians, particularly. There are other smaller national groups even who I'm not going to talk about right now, but Syria likewise, Lebanon likewise, and of course, as we know, the land of Israel had at the time Arabs, Sunni Arabs, as the entire region had since the caliphates, had a small community of Jews who had been there over the entire period. The land of Israel was never without a Jewish presence, and also including Jewish communities who over the generations had moved in small numbers from the diaspora back to the land of Israel, particularly after the Spanish Inquisition and Spanish expulsions, but not only. So it's a multinational, multi-religious area. And if we think about the first map, or in the second map, the one of the Arab world, this is not a well-known thing. Many people think about the Middle East and North Africa as this kind of Arab area where Arabs are indigenous. And I think that I've explained that the Arabs are indigenous to the Arabian Peninsula and then have a very strong cultural and demographic presence because of the Arab empires. But that the peoples who predate the Arabs were not fully assimilated. And so by the time we get to World War I, they're influenced by these national movements in the Ottoman Empire, and they seek to have independent states. And in fact, the Zionist movement, and this is something perhaps at a later date I'll give a lecture on for the Scholars Circle, but the first people to articulate the modern Zionist movement, as we know, like the idea that more Jews, that it was not sufficient to have a small Jewish community in the historic land of Israel, but that Jews should try to leave the diaspora and to move there in larger numbers and reestablish some kind of Jewish sovereignty in the historical land of Israel through a organized political action. That's something that first appears in the Ottoman Empire with various two important rabbinic figures who use a very modern strategy. Their names are Rabbi Yehuda Bibas and Rabbi Yehuda Alkalai. So With World War I, what's important to understand is these treaties that I gave a list to you for, these treaties ultimately, at the end of the day, didn't ended up favoring the two largest national groups in the area, the Turks and the Arabs. And the British and the French had their reasons for favoring these two groups. For the British, it was oil, and the French also had, their own geopolitical reasons. So, unlike in Europe, where many of the national groups received their national self-determination, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Austria and Hungary, were fully retracted to just being nation states, leaving an imperial diaspora all over. There were Hungarians in Romania, there were Hungarians in Slovakia, or in the Slovak part of the Czechoslovak state that was created after World War I. There were Germans all over the entire area, part of these German colonizers who had moved with the Austrian Empire's control over eastern areas. So these imperial diasporas remained. In the case of the Ottoman Empire in southern Europe, there were all these Balkan wars where Turks were expelled, and the wars of independence were quite brutal. So these imperial diasporas of Turks had already been impacted, but there were still significant diasporas of Turks around in the Balkans, so much so that the Greeks and the Turks ended up having a population exchange in the aftermath of World War I, and with Greeks in Turkey moving to Greece and vice versa. So we have a situation where in the Middle East, though, the Allied powers have a preference for the Arabs and the Turks, and so they completely abandon any project of Kurdish or Syrian national independence. And then with the Maronite Christians and with the Jews, they are ambivalent supporters. And so we have a situation of instability in both Lebanon and Israel in relation to this. And of course, we have, and we'll talk about this in just a few minutes, about the instability with the Kurdish people not receiving instability, violence on the part of the states who want to suppress the Kurds. That's what I mean by instability. But so then I would like to go, though, before we go to questions, because we have about 7 minutes to questions. So this is kind of unfinished business, meaning that the smaller nations get put under the power of the Turks or the Arabs in various states and the mandates. And if we look at, if you take a look at map 12, you'll see the mandates that were created. And so that's one of the sources of tension in the region. And then another source of tension in the region is the development and I want to speak just a little bit before I get to that, though, about Arab nationalism. So the Arabs had been under Ottoman power, and so they hadn't, they also joined with the British, like these other smaller nations, to overthrow the Ottomans, and they had, though, aspirations of ruling all of the areas where there was a significant Arab-speaking population and a significant ethnic Arab population. And so they wanted to rule over areas where the Assyrians wanted independence, or where the Kurds wanted independence, or where the Jews wanted independence, or where the Maronite Christians wanted some control. And this is a very, very important issue and a very important thing to understand. And likewise, the Turks also, meaning that they maintained, the Arabs had an imperial vision of the state that they wanted to create, that they assumed that wherever Arabs were large in number, that they should be ruling. And so the Arab state, if we can look at map 11, there was a very brief Arab state that was created in 1920. And as you can see, it's occupying areas. The idea of it was that there would be Arab control over areas that have other smaller national populations, and including ones that predate even the Arab Caliphate, like the Assyrians and the Jews and the Kurds, etc. So this is a source. What's important about this point is that Arab nationalism has as a founding element the idea that Arabs should rule even if there are other nationalities in the region and even if these other nationalities predate them. And Arab nationalism in most of the 20th and including 21st century has had most Arab nationalists, or as a broad movement, we can say, has had difficulty accommodating the independence of these groups. Maybe some autonomy for them, maybe, but not independence. That's something, and so it's expressed already in World War I with all of the proposals and plans given by Arab leaders, which don't really make any provisions or don't or assume that there will be no independence for these smaller peoples in the region. So if we go back to the other 2 points that I talked about that impact the region, this issue of religion and then the issue of political economy. So the World War I is just one more nail in the coffin of what's happened to Muslim power, right? The Muslim thinkers were thinking about that already in the 18th and 19th century. And so one of the movements that comes out of that question is what we call modern political Islam, or Islamism. And the main group for that is the Muslim Brotherhood, and they're a group that begins in Egypt, and they are asking all these questions about the power of the West, and their response is to kind of have a modern revolutionary movement which will restore Muslim power. And what's important about them is, I mean, most Muslims would, as do most Christians up until the mid-20th century or later, want the entire world to be Muslim. This is not something new, as most Christians want the entire world to be Christian. That's why there's missionizing and the rest of it. But in the Muslim Brotherhood is much more active against this, and they're much more willing also to go against conservative Muslims, or Muslims they think are not revolutionary enough. That's one of their defining features. And then another defining feature is that they have a very, very strong kind of fascist and anti-Semitic aspect to their thinking. Their major thinkers, Hassan al-Banna, Said Qutb, have a very, very strong anti-Semitism. And the Muslim Brotherhood impacts almost every single Islamist movement in the region, including the Shia Islamists, the Iranian, the Iranians who, so the Ayatollah Khomeini, he translated Muslim Brotherhood texts from Arabic into Persian. And so there is a common kind of revolutionary spirit and a common sort of very strong anti-Semitism. And what I mean by anti-Semitism is that it's not that, I mean, traditional Muslim texts view Islam as being superior to Judaism, but have some kind of place for Judaism. And you can find places in the Muslim texts where it's more positive, less positive, even if there's a hierarchy. But the Islamists are very, very negative towards the Jews and towards the state of Israel, or at least the Zionist movement initially, because it's even predates the state of Israel. It's in the 1920s and 30s, and then afterwards, the state of Israel. So if we now kind of bring, I'd like to, before I conclude in the next 2 minutes, I'd like to show 2 more images. I'd like to show a document, if we could go to document 2. So this kind of unfinished business of national and imperial movements between Arab expectations in the region and these smaller national groups, the tension between Islamists, and then there are Arab nationalists who are secular and who are influenced by the communist movement, and that's why I brought up this issue of political economy. All of this leads, if you can, this is a list taken off a Wikipedia page of conflicts in the modern Middle East. And as you can see, this is only 2 decades. So it's not even, this list goes from World War I until today. Or I think even, I don't want to missay something, but it's the modern period. I believe it's the 20th century. Anyway, we can see here that there's a tremendous number of wars. It's a very unstable area. It's an area of wars that are civil wars. So the first one, the Kurdish-Turkish conflict, is a national conflict between this national group, which does not have independence. We've got civil wars between different political groups within the same country, like the Yemenite War. We have the Iranian Revolution, where we have an Islamist Iranian political group taking over against monarchist and group under the Shah. We have so we've got we have, you know, if you look at the Islamic insurgency in Saudi Arabia, we have all of these tensions, whether they're national, whether they're between religious groups or between different parties, are creating a lot of instability in this region, which otherwise should be a pretty wealthy region. It's a region that has tremendous natural resources and had the capacity to build institutions and to educate their populations, etc. So, so the kind of the encapsulation of this is that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is not a unicorn, right? That the Jews are one of a number of national groups who would like their historic homeland and to be sovereign in their historic homeland in this post-World War I order. And they're given some support from the Allies to do that, but not full support. And so they live in a conflict with Arab nationalists who elsewhere in the region, not just against Israelis, but who have trouble with non-Arab power in the region. And also they have opponents with Islamists who are also against them for being Jews, as Islamists have had difficulty in being very violent with other non-Islamic religious groups in the areas. If anyone who's followed what happened to the Yazidis and the Assyrian Christians with ISIS. So we're living in the shadow of World War I. I hope this gives you a bit of a picture and an outline. The silver lining on this rather bleak picture is that the Abraham Accords offers us an instance of Arab states that have retracted both in the traditional Arab nationalist difficulty with non-Arab states and powers in the region, and have also shown a greater acceptance of non-Muslim states in the region. And if we can go in that direction, I think there's a future. But right now, there's very strong powers among the Islamists and among the imperialists. Now I go to Nina for questions. I'm happy to hear what you'd like to discuss further.
All right, so I want to start out by thanking you for your historical perspective. And we're going to turn to questions now. You can submit questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I want to start with two related questions. One is the Palestinian-Israeli conflict a unique conflict? And related to that, what would the preconditions for the Kurdish or the Assyrian people to have their own state?
So, so there are some elements of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that are a little different, but there are elements that are quite similar to the other smaller national groups. So what's a little bit different with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is that a very large percentage of the world's Jewish community lived outside of the land of Israel. Now, the Armenians at one point lived in an overwhelming majority outside of the Armenian homeland. They lived like that because the Safavid Empire, which I'd showed you a map of, had in fact emptied Armenia of Armenians, or at least Eastern Armenia. And then when the Russian Empire was battling the Safavid Empire, invited the Armenians back. So there's a parallel with the Jews in that most national movements in the region, they are able to have some kind of impact because they have an ally with a competing imperial power. In the case of the Jews, it's the British. In the case of the Armenians, it was the Russians. So even though the Jews, in contrast, the Assyrians are living primarily in their historical homeland, there isn't a major diaspora, or the Kurds are also. So, but the Jews are not, even though they're somewhat different by degree, I don't think they're that different from the Armenians in kind, for example. So that's to answer that part of it. And what's happened with the Palestinians, and this is not totally unique either, as the Arab nationalist movement was unable to create a unitary Arab state, like I showed you that map of in 1920 of a state that covered all of today's Lebanon, Iraq, or much of Iraq, much of Syria, and much of what's today Israel, West Bank, Gaza, etc. They weren't able to form a unitary state, and so there were the mandates were created by the allies for their own reasons, and then from the mandates we have these separate states, Iraq, Syria, etc. Now, Sunni Arabs in most of these places controlled the state and put in place forced Arabization. What's different with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and let's say the Lebanese civil war conflict is that unlike in Iraq or in Syria, where the Sunni Muslims were able to just effectively take control, or in Egypt, for example, right? And there's no real opposition from the other minority groups. In the case of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or in the case of Lebanon, the Christian Lebanese are simply too strong to be squashed, and the Jews are too strong to be squashed, even though there's an attempt to do so. Right, there's an attempt by the Arab powers to do that, to get to a situation where the Jews are within an Arab Palestine, like the Kurds are within an Arab Iraq, for example. So, but it just fails. That project fails, and so the wars of 48 and 67 and 73 fail, and so then the Palestinians develop a different tactic, modeled on the Algerian War, where they describe themselves as as the indigenous people of the region, and the Jews as these Western colonizers. And it has some logic. I mean, it's not true, because the Jews are indigenous to the region, even though they had been living in the diaspora for a long time. But that logic, even though it's a false logic and it's not a true representation, it's been able to persuade a lot of people, because a lot of people don't know a lot about the history of the region. It's precisely the people who have not listened to this lecture who are confused about this point. So that's for your first part of the question. And as for the second part of the question, what would it take for the Kurds and the Assyrians to have a state? So the Assyrians are in a bad state because they have left in large numbers. The Kurds have had, and the Baluchis, I haven't spoken about them, but they are also another people who are stateless and divided between 4 states: Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, or 3 states. I'm forgetting the 4th. But the Baluch people, they've had insurgencies, and the Kurds have had insurgencies, meaning they've been fighting militarily, and they just haven't really succeeded in these insurgencies. The Kurds have finally managed, with the destruction of Iraq, to get an autonomous region with the kind of the wars in Iraq. But whether they'll be able to hold on to it is another story, and they hope they will. The Assyrians were very badly persecuted by the Syrian and Iraqi state, and a lot of them left. And so the Assyrian population is significantly reduced in its homeland. So the likelihood, and there's also some conflict between the Kurds and the Assyrians over the territory. Just because 2 smaller nationalities have a bigger opponent in the empire doesn't mean that they necessarily agree amongst themselves. And we've seen smaller conflicts between smaller nationalities. So the chances of a Kurdish state, I think, are possible. The chances of an Assyrian state strike me as less likely, unless the Assyrians can really organize and they can find some kind of modus vivendi with the Kurds, which is not impossible. But what would it take? So it would take a change of government in Turkey, and a change of government in Iran, and a change of government in Syria, and as there has been in Iraq. And it would take what I call imperial rollback, which is that the Iranians, the Arabs, I mean, as a broader culture, no longer have an imperial vision of themselves, no longer assume that it is their right to rule over other peoples, right? And that is a cultural shift. Maybe the cultural shift will happen after facts occur on the ground, as they did in World War I, where the Hungarians just sort of had to accept the fact that they're not an empire anymore, or it might have to precede it. But it would certainly be necessary for long-term stability for a Kurdish state.
Thank you. That was a great answer. I have 2 more questions that are kind of related, and they're kind of play off of what you just said. One is, it seems that the context of the national situation of Israel and the Jews is more misunderstood than other groups. Would you agree? And I want to add to this, someone asked, who exactly are the Palestinians? How long have they been on the territory that's now Israel? And were they someplace else before?
So with regard to the first question, the misunderstanding about the Jews comes, I think, largely from the fact that the Jews do have a long diaspora, where the Jewish communities are significantly impacted by the cultures in which they live in the diaspora. So the Jews in the diaspora have a sort of hybrid identity, where on the one hand, they're Jews and they're recognized as such by their neighbors, and they're seen as different by their neighbors, and they have a liturgical language, they have holidays, they have customs that differentiate them. And on the other hand, they no longer speak a national language or one single national language. And their customs of the way they dress, they might all not eat pork, for example, if they're traditionalists, especially up until, let's say, the 18th or 19th century, where traditionalism is the majority practice. But their foodways and their fashion is influenced by the surrounding area. And so those are the kind of, so they're recognized as a national group by most of the cultures where they are. They're not, there's no confusion about that. At the same time, and particularly with the modern period where there's emancipation and the Jews are increasingly acculturating, they have this weird hybrid identity. And especially in the American context, where the majority of Jews come from the Eastern European diaspora, right, and where they talk about themselves having come from Europe, right, which is true in a sense that that's the last place of the diaspora they were, even though, you know, if you ask a bit further, they'll say, well, Jews traditionally come from the Middle East, and they had it, you know, but so it creates it. If you don't have a lot of historical knowledge, and you don't, then it's not the connection between the Jews of the Middle East and the Jews of the Jewish diaspora is not clear, and then it seems more plausible. That's why I was saying that there are ways in which this idea that Jews are European colonizers are plausible if you don't know very much about the area. If you just think, oh, there's a bunch of the Jews before they came to the United States were in Poland, so they must be European. And then what are they doing in the Middle East? You know, so that's how it happens. It happens with lack of knowledge. Then you can make that narrative seem like it makes sense. And with regard to who the Palestinians are, so the Palestinians, by their language and religion, are the inheritors of the Muslim caliphates in the area, meaning they arrived in they're Levantine Arabs. They're like the Arabs in Syria, like the Arabs in Iraq, like they're Arabs who arrived with the Muslim conquests. And then Palestinians, like in most of these areas, the Arabs who arrived the Muslim conquests also married local people. So that's why most likely that's why there's a fair amount of Jewish DNA for Palestinians, because there was, but in the time of the Palestinian conquests, still a significant Jewish population. And in fact, there's some scholars who argue the Jews were the majority of the population of the region of the land of Israel in the time of the Muslim conquests, and not the other population at the time would have been Christian and some Greeks. And so the Palestinians, and that's their cultural inheritance, and their Palestinian families. Palestinians have a family and a clan structure, and who proudly know of their descendants from clans and from the Arabian Peninsula. So there's a famous professor of Palestinian history called Rashid Khalidi. He's at Columbia, and his family has a library in Jerusalem. You can look them up online. It's called the Khalidi Library. And that library describes the history of the Khalidi family and talks about them being an Ashraf family, meaning a family related to the Prophet, meaning from the Arabian Peninsula, who had arrived in that area in the Middle Ages. So other people, so the Palestinians are Arabs from these conquests or from subsequent waves of Arabs who then, with some admixture of local peoples, including also in the Ottoman period of Caucasian peoples or Ottoman or Turkish peoples who had arrived in the area. So there's a member of Knesset in Israel who's a Palestinian of that kind of origin, whose family isn't actually Arab, but who's who's a Palestinian. So that's who the Palestinians are, and that's what the genetic evidence describes, just as the genetics, and I don't mean genetics in any kind of racial eugenic form. I'm just saying that, we can kind of track the history and know people is pure. It's an anthropological category, but we know a little bit of which peoples mix with what peoples through some of this genetics, and it tends to map on quite well with what we know from the history.
Okay, thanks. I have one last question. In a college course, the professor commented that land was appropriated by Israel via the absentee landlord rule. How is this significant? Or just same question, tell me more about absentee landlord land acquisition after the 48 war.
So before I get into that, it's important to understand that prior to 1948, because this is a very significant point, prior to 1948, the Zionist movement established itself on land that they had bought. And this is a very, very significant and important point, because it also has political implications for many indigenous people today who see it as an example of what they call land back, that they can buy back land, or they can acquire, if they're not able to acquire it through some kind of new treaty, or through the reactivation of an old treaty, or through some new or through some other legal means. And so that's what the Jewish community did after the 1948 war, with the flight. There's a whole historiography about where the Palestinians, why they fled, whether it was under the threat of Jewish violence or whether it was under the encouragement of the Arab leadership who thought that they were going to win very quickly. I don't want to get into the different positions about that, but once Israel had secured a victory in 1948, then they established, they did confiscate land, in the sense that people who were no longer there, they took the land from that. The legality or not legality of that, I think that's for a whole different discussion, in the sense that the objectives of these the countries who fought the war against Israel fought it in order to destroy a state that had been voted on. The partition had been voted by the United Nations and accepted. And so Ben-Gurion, who was a major strategist and whose interest was the survival of the Jewish people, then just took his advantage where he could, hoping to leverage it then afterwards for a peaceful resolution, meaning he didn't want to be at war permanently. But in the context of absent people, then there was land that was taken by the Israelis. There's no doubt about that. I want to, though, add one more point, though, which is important in relation to that, is that much of the Jewish community in the aftermath, not just in 1948, but even prior to that, much of the Jewish community in the countries that had waged a war against Israel were expelled and expropriated. And so there are people who argue, and this is there are people who argue that there was effectively a kind of population exchange that happened between the Palestinian Arabs who fled in the context of a war supported by these other countries, and the Jewish community that was expelled in these other countries, Egypt, Syria, etc., and where there was an expropriation on both sides, both Israeli and of these other states. And I think in terms of various peace proposals, questions of compensation of all parties, whether it be the Palestinians or whether it be the Jews who were expropriated from these other countries, are part of the discussion, if you will.
Thank you so much for your insightful presentation. Our next Scholar Circle lecture features Dr. Shale Horowitz on refuting the ideological assault on Israel. The lecture will be live on Monday, June 3rd at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you again, Dr. Olga Kirschbaum-Shirosky, and thank you everyone for attending, and we hope to see you next time.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.